All right, so welcome back, everybody, from your networking session with Michaela. I hope it went well and you've enjoyed the conference so far. We are back with our next speaker, Brent, and I will just do a little quick intro. So Brent has delivered external client-facing projects for customers around the world, as well as innovation programs leveraging global resources to develop new product lines. He has built the PMO at Christie and Institute program project evaluation and prioritization process to drive decisions by an alignment within executives management. Brent is fascinated by the intersection of business, technology, and project management, and sprinkle in a little deliberate team culture, and you have a recipe to unlock exciting transformations. So we're looking very much forward to your presentation, Brent. So I will stop sharing my screen and pass over the rights to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Santa. I hope everyone's having a good day. I hope everyone enjoyed David's discussion about gamification and Michaela's communication with stakeholders, both really great topics. I enjoyed them myself, so thank you very much for that. I will share my screen here. All right, hopefully everybody can see the screen.
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, so let's talk about Agile. So it was mentioned in some of the previous presentations, which is always nice. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is it, how does it work, tips for applying it in both projects, your team culture, and as well as your personal life. Because I think there are all sorts of different great learnings we can take away from the process. So it has been said that the only constant is change, which I feel is very true. Things are constantly evolving around us. So if we're going to succeed in this environment, we need to be very good at adapting to change. And that's really what Agile is all about, is being able to explore the unknown. So let's look at a little bit of an example here, okay? So you're asked to go out and you're asked to rescue someone, and you need to pick them up from point A and you need to take them to point B, right? Well, if we've done this a million times and we're very familiar with the terrain, great. But what happens when we're not? We may have done these types of things before, but this may be new terrain. So, we're given this picture and we know where we want to start. We know where we want to end up. Things are looking good, right? Maybe traditionally we'd say, okay, here's the plan. And we lay out this beautiful plan. We get gurneys, we get excellent hiking shoes, all sorts of things to help us traverse this terrain, right? The problem is we don't know what we don't know. And when we finally get into it, we find out that this is actually what we're looking at, right? And all the preparation in the world didn't really prepare us for this. And now we have to pivot and make some decisions about how we're going to accomplish what we want to accomplish. And this is where I really feel that Agile comes into play, right? When you realize you need to do things differently, or when you're in an environment where you don't know everything that's going on. So apparently the platform does not have a mechanism, but I always like to understand how many of the people have some familiarity with Agile. Have you been involved in Agile projects? Do you understand what it's all about? Normally I'd ask for a show of hands, but unfortunately that's not possible within the platform. So we will just move on. So what is Agile? I like to think of Agile as the blitzkrieg approach to project management, okay? It's a swift, focused approach using flexible and adaptable forces, including stakeholders and customers, okay? It prioritizes motion over planning. So, in the great words of Walt Disney, the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. In a nutshell, Agile prioritizes demonstration of results over documentation, okay? For those of you who may be new to project management, and I know some of the people in the audience may not have been through a lot of projects, I used to work in some government aspects. I worked on projects providing radar to the FAA and DoD. These were radars that were deployed all around the world. These are very, very large projects with many, many people involved in all sorts of different segments. And you can imagine the amount of documentation. Even just the testing ended up being a binder that was about 3 inches thick for each test of every radar that was delivered, right? So when we talk about producing documentation, sometimes you talk about the project is done when the documentation reaches a specific weight, right? There are projects where a great deal of effort is put into documentation. So, oh, for some reason, oh, there we go. Okay, sorry, my computer froze for a minute. All right, so let's talk about what really makes up Agile. So the Agile Manifesto, right? It values individual interactions over processes and tools, okay? Again, talking to the people. Working software, and again, Agile came from a software background, working software over comprehensive documentation, okay? That doesn't mean that you can only use Agile in software, but that's sort of where it came from. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but this really gets into the aspect of trust, right? Contract negotiation is defining exactly what the customer wants, right? And what you're willing to provide for the price. When you get into Agile and you say, okay, you know what? We have a notion of what the customer has a notion of what they want, but we're not going to try and define it all. We're going to get started along the path, and we're going to work with them and allow that notion to maybe change and evolve as we go down the path. That takes a lot of trust on both parties, right? And that's not possible with every customer relationship. Not every customer is comfortable with that, right? And then responding to change over following a plan, okay? Not to say that you shouldn't have a plan, but as Mike Tyson or anybody fighting Mike Tyson or anybody who's been involved in war, your plan goes out the window when the first shot is fired, right? Or the first punch lands, because you have to have a plan and you have to have an idea of where you're going, but the reality is it's not going to go to plan, and you're going to have to make split-second decisions along the way. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about who maybe exemplifies Agile project management. Does Agile come naturally to us as a race, or is Agile something we have to learn and strive? And I don't know if you've ever seen Tom Wojcik's Marshmallow Challenge video. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It'll be a great 10 minutes, and there are lots of other things to take away. But he says the best performers are kindergartners. And the reason is that kindergartners don't have all these preconceived notions about how things should work, right? They just try stuff, and if it works, they keep going. And if it doesn't work, they take a different direction, right? They build on what works, and they're not afraid to fail. And that's really what Agile is all about, right? You start building stuff and you see what's working. And if you decide that, you demo it to a stakeholder and the stakeholder says, that's not really where I was trying to go. Well, why continue down that path any further? Let's pivot and go in a different direction. So how does Agile work? In a nutshell, spend most of your time building, okay? And have frequent iterations and keep them small, right? So Agile doesn't mean there's no planning at all, but there's a little bit of time spent planning, most of the time spent building, and then you have a quick test, and then some demos to your stakeholders or delivery of the next version, and get your feedback, and then go back, plan, spend most of the time building, and then again, test and deliver, and just continually repeat. And these sprints that they're called, these iterations often are referred to as sprints, can be anywhere from a week to a month, but the goal is to keep them small and have frequent touch points so that if you need to pivot, you can identify it as early as possible and go in a different direction. So two common Agile methodologies are Kanban and Scrum, okay? Kanban, in a very simplistic sense, is a backlog of tasks that the team needs to burn through during a sprint, okay? Or through their sprints. Scrum, on the other hand, is a leader-led team where the leader focuses on clearing roadblocks and keeping the team focused on delivering the code, okay? While Agile assigns the majority of time to development, this isn't to say that there is no forethought or discussion that goes about the team planning process. Agile methodologies promote frequent team sync points, okay? So these are like daily stand-up meetings, okay? But in Scrum, you also have a planning meeting at the beginning of your sprint. And this is where you get the team together and you talk about the features that you're going to try and get into this sprint, okay? And what happens at the planning meeting is when you talk about the features, people are asked to estimate how much work it will be. And this isn't something where they go away, they do a bunch of research and planning, and then they come back and they say, I think it's going to be 4 days, right? And it took them 3 days to come up with that answer, right? Typically, you use the SWAG method. If you're not familiar with the SWAG method, it's very common in business and all sorts of different disciplines. Okay, SWAG stands for sweet, wild, ass, guess. Okay, everybody guesses how much they think it's going to take. And typically, you'll end up with fairly consistent results. But when you do end up with very wildly different results, you'll go around and you'll talk to the people who had the highest numbers or the most difficult, they think it's going to be most difficult. And you're going to say, why do you think that's the most difficult? Why do you think it's so difficult? And then you're going to go around and you're going to talk to the other people who think it's going to be really easy. And you're going to say, why do you think it's so easy? And the reason you're doing this is so that you can get the ideas and the input in, right? And you may have people who go, the easy people may go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Or the hard people may go, oh, wow, that's a great way of approaching the problem. I never would have thought about doing it that way. Okay, so again, there's a small amount of planning. Most of the time is spent in execution. So let's talk about some tips for applying Agile. And I'm moving through these slides fairly quickly so that we can spend most of our time chatting, okay? So Agile and projects, okay? Is Agile the right methodology, okay, or the right philosophy to apply to your project? And that doesn't mean that once you have a hammer, everything should look like a nail, right? There are going to be some things where a hammer is better. It's better to use nails. There are other activities where the screw is definitely the better option, okay? So are we exploring or developing something new, right? Agile is really great when you have a notion of where you're going, but you don't have a concrete understanding of what it is and how you're going to get there because you've been there 12 million times. You're going to the grocery store. You go, get in your car, you drive down the road, you turn left, then you turn right, then you turn left again, and you're in the parking lot, right? Or are we simply running the printing process again, right? And that's the example of going to the grocery store. We've been there, we know how to do it. We can accurately predict how long these things are going to take. And well, yes, there may be times where it deviates. It doesn't make sense necessarily to run an agile project in all of those situations for customers who are looking for predictable performance. Is the customer or the champion comfortable with Agile? If they're not, then it doesn't make sense to proceed with Agile, right? Or you need to slowly work them into it. So maybe using Agile on your really big, important project is maybe not the right place to start. As I said before, how much trust exists with the client, right? There has to be a certain amount of trust with Agile. Those clients that are used to receiving 3 inches of documentation, both before as the proposal process and then throughout the testing process and then as part of the delivery, well, that may not be the right project to start with them on Agile, right? Maybe find a smaller project. Ease of embracing change, right? One of the things that is fairly typical when you need to integrate things from different companies, you have to have what are called interfaces, okay? So this is how are things going to communicate? How are they going to work together, right? Those interfaces need to be defined. You need to have documentation on those, right? So, if you have a lot of those types of things, whether you may still run Agile in your different teams, some of those things may need to be well-defined and may not be suitable for Agile, or you may need to do integration frequently if possible, but that's not always possible. What else do we have here? Team member skill. So if you're using Agile for the first time, that's great, right? You shouldn't let it be a roadblock. But equally, if you haven't done any training in the team, and this is a really important project, using this as your transition project may not be the right answer, right? Find something small, something where people can fail or run into problems, and you'll work through it and you'll learn and you'll be stronger as a team for it. And that's the right way to introduce, at least in my opinion, the right way to introduce Agile into an organization that hasn't done Agile in the past. And we'll talk a little bit more about Agile culture in the next slide. And finally, how is failure perceived, right? Agile aligns nicely with the fail fast mentality. So failure in the short term only really matters if we don't learn, okay? As long as we're learning and adapting, it's not really failure, right? You think of the kindergartners and they try something and the marshmallow falls over. That's okay, right? They realized that way didn't work. Thomas Edison famously said, A reporter said to him, "Weren't you discouraged after you failed 1,800 times in inventing the light bulb?" And he said, "Well, I didn't fail 1,800 times in inventing the light bulb. I found 1,800 ways not to invent a light bulb." Okay, so let's talk about Agile in the team culture. So how do we knit it into the very fabric of our organization? Okay, we talked about how failure is perceived in the organization, and then we really need to shift the organization to a growth mindset. Okay, how can we iterate faster and speed up learning? We need to create an environment where people can focus, 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 focus. Endless meetings peppered throughout the day only interferes with progress. As the PM or the executive, work to protect your producers. Okay, there are people in your organization, people who work for you that are doing the work. Every time you pull them away from doing the work, they're not doing the work. Okay, so find ways to avoid them being distracted from the main value add. All right. Praise and reward those who demonstrate results quickly, especially when those results result in new insights and potentially driving a pivot. Okay. You do have to focus in order to get things done. You know, pivoting for the use of pivoting is not always the best answer, but there are lots of times you'll find in organizations where you're caught in a large waterfall and everybody's working towards the answer and you're into it and you realize, guys, we really need to go in a different direction. And there is a certain amount of momentum that exists and it's really hard to change. And this is where Agile really shines, right? In a small iteration, you know, if you were to break that into smaller parts, everybody gets together at the beginning and the end to be able to say, hey, let's see what's going on. What have we learned? Hey, you know what? We need to go in a different direction. It's much easier to change the flow at that point. Okay. Prioritizing individuals and interactions through discussion that drives action. Okay. Remember the quote from Disney earlier? There's value in doing. Should always focus on driving actions. And when discussion drags on, try and focus on what do we need to decide on in order to drive the action? What is holding us up? What do we need to go do in order to enable the decision? Okay. Always try and focus on action. Team members. So there are bad apples. Okay. There are people who won't fit into the culture, and people who don't fit into the culture aren't necessarily bad. So please don't confuse those two statements. But there are people who are always looking to protect themselves or cover their backside. And while these people exist, these are not typically people we want on our teams. Okay. Or we need to put them in places in our organization where they can succeed. Not everybody meshes with the culture, and that's okay. But it is important as leaders to understand that 80% of the time, performance problems are really systems problems. Okay, and only 20% of the time, it's really a personal problem. Now, you do want to move people into more productive roles as quickly as possible if they're not a fit for your team. And finally, in the great words of Stephen Covey, when we're exploring new opportunities, we always need to be sharpening the saw. Okay, and even when we're not exploring new opportunities, but it equips the team with new tools and keeps everybody's mind open to new ideas. Okay, and the reason there is no 6 is because his sharpening the saw was number 7 in his habits of highly successful people. So if you're wondering if we missed 6, we didn't. It was on purpose. All right, Agile in your personal life. So we talked about adopting a growth mindset for the organizations. And that is very much the same in your personal life, right? I haven't achieved the goal yet. If you haven't seen The Social Dilemma if you have seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix, then you know that your attention is auctioned off at 6 cents or 3 cents to the highest bidder. Okay, so putting structure in your life to help you focus on the things that matter to you is really important to your success. Okay, break things down into short sprints, focus, 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 focus on the work. Okay. Well, we set out personal goals, and personal goals are important. I love 5-year plans, project manager at heart. We have to accept the fact that pivots will occur along the way. Okay. Remember that opportunity knocks and temptation breaks the door down. Okay. This is why people uninstall the social media apps on their phones so that they aren't tempted to squander away their time. Okay. Not saying that social media is bad, but it definitely has its place. Also keep in mind that the average overnight success was 11 years in the making. Okay, so persistence and resilience is important. You tend to be the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. So while reflection is important, new ideas often come from interactions with other individuals. Just make sure you have some of the right individuals in those circles. So consciously think about who you're spending your time with, and is that driving you to the person you want to be? Okay. Not saying these people are bad, but if you want to, for example, learn about nuclear fission or nuclear fusion, surrounding yourself who know about that would definitely result in you learning about it faster than surrounding yourself with people who are not interested and know nothing about it. Okay. Collaborate on big, hairy, audacious goals. If you haven't heard of big, hairy, audacious goals, there's a great book called Built to Last that talks about big, hairy, audacious goals and why companies that start out the same do exceedingly better than their peer group. Okay. Don't be afraid to set big, hairy, audacious goals and find people to collaborate with you on those big, hairy, audacious goals, right? Find common ground, find people who are passionate about the things that you're passionate about. And finally, always be learning new things, right? This keeps you open to new ideas and change. Okay, so many of you may have learned or heard about SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Okay, there is another philosophy called FAST goals. Okay, which FAST goals work really nice with Agile. Frequently discussed, ambitious, specific, and transparent. Okay, and I've used both of them, and I think both of them add value. The thing that I have always felt that is missing from SMART is the ambitious side, right? I may set the bar really high, and if you only get to 80%, well, if your 100% was 100% higher than everybody else, you're still beating the crap out of everybody else. You still way exceeded expectations, right? Unfortunately, not every manager has that mentality, right? Some people look at it as, well, did you achieve the end goal? And if you didn't achieve the end goal, then you failed, right? And unfortunately, that is not what I would consider a growth mindset. But there are those people and there are those situations. So you have to decide, like choosing the right framework, what is the right framework for your goals? So, and that's all I have. Any questions?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brent. Really great content. Just listening and kind of like I would like you to go on for another half an hour. So everybody, please key in your questions in the chat box here and make sure to address all panelists so that we're able to see your questions.
So while we're waiting, I have a couple other things that I can talk about. Some other things that came up that I would like to comment on in the other sessions, right? Emails or chat communication in general. Great way to move information. But if you're talking about something and the person hasn't got it by the time you get to the third reply, don't bother sending a fourth one. Pick up the phone, walk over and see them, okay? Because more communication in this mode is not necessarily the right answer. It's squandering time, okay?
So first question for you, do you prefer Kanban or Scrum?
I think it depends on the situation. So again, I'm all about a situation kind of guy, right? My goal is to have as large a toolbox as possible. So when I look at a situation, I can say, you know what, that's the right one for the scenario. So when you're dealing with, let's say, larger types of functionality, and you have different experts or different people bringing different perspectives into a room, right? And that was actually one of the things I wanted to comment on, was that everyone does everything in Agile. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? You may have some people who are really strong at, say, matrix transformations if you're doing software, right? Matrix transformations in math, and you may have other people who are really good with style and GUI, right? Well, the people who are good with style and GUI are likely to take the style and GUI items, and the people who are good with the matrix transformations are likely to pull those, right? So when you end up in those types of situations, right, if you're trying to understand, well, is this particular request something we can accomplish in a sprint, or do we need to break it down? And how long do we think it's going to take, right? Is this something where the guy who takes that should be able to do 7 other things, or is the guy who's taking that only going to be able to accomplish this in the timeline of the sprint? And that's where Scrum is really great, right? Because you can get those ideas and you can say, hey, you know what? This is what we need to do. We need to be able to take this video image and pull out the relevant data and map it into a different space, right? And that's matrix transformations, right? So then you say, okay, you know, the matrix transformation, 1 or 2 of your matrix transformation mathematicians might say, hey, you know what? This is actually really easy. We can use this library. This should take a day, right? Whereas somebody else looking at it may look at it and say, oh, you know what? I have no idea how to do that. That's going to take me 3 months in order to just wrap my head around even what I need to accomplish and pilot and try and do it, right? So I think that, again, you look at the situation and you say, okay, you know what? For this type of thing, you know, I'm developing a data management application, and this is something where I've done this before, and there's really not a lot of variation in what I need to do. It's just some different data fields. You end up with a Kanban, and you have a backlog of tasks, and you need to work through them, right? So again, it depends on the situation.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. So there is another question here.
Yep.
What advice would you give? Hold on. So what advice would you give on convincing management to switch to Agile approach when they have been doing waterfall for years?
So this is a great question. So in my past life, I don't manage projects the same way I used to. I used to be a program manager, a project manager. And one of the things I would inherit was failing projects. I often was assigned failing projects. And that was because I guess I was good at turning them around, keeping the customer happy. But my philosophy is always there's short-term and there's long-term planning. What you need to do in the short term may be different than what you need to do in the long term. You need to address the customer's issues right away, but those may not be the best long-term problems, right? So in an organization where you have waterfall, typically they're always looking for what's the whole plan, right? And unfortunately, projects are not always linear. There are some projects which are well suited for Agile, and there are some projects where waterfall works just fine, right? They're predictable in nature. So I think you need to, first of all, decide, is Agile the right methodology, right? And there are people who have said that, you know, you can't do a hybrid between the two. And I would argue that a little bit. I don't think you should do a hybrid between the two just so you can say both, right? But there may be situations where some teams may function better in Agile for certain aspects, and other teams may function better in waterfall. But again, I would always try and find a place where you can try it and show some results, right? You know, you're to try and convince management that, hey, we've got this really big project that, you know, we just landed with this super important client, and the client is used to waterfall, management is used to waterfall. Trying to introduce Agile into that discussion is probably a non-starter. Okay, but if you can find somebody, a client who's done Agile in the past, a small project where, hey, you know what, we want to do this. Yeah, it's important, but if it were to expand in time because of learning or realization, you know, that's the ideal place to try it, right? Because you want people to get familiar with it, and then you can show some success. And once you show some success, it will be easier to convince and show people where else to try it, right? If you take a small team and you show success, people will want to be part of that team in the future because people are drawn to success, right? Whereas if you take a large team that hasn't done this in the past and they're under a lot of pressure and you try and force something new down their throats, it's not going to be well received, and there's going to be a lot of what I like to call the corporate immune system, which is just going to kill it off, right? So you have to sort of do it on a stealth basis or a small project basis to develop that track record.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And also how to introduce in terms of just like definition, because I've noticed there are a lot of people who throw around word agile, not really knowing what exactly that means, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so there's another question here. If the client requests a major change during a sprint, do you try to accommodate it or finish the sprint and include that in the next sprint?
So I think that would depend on the type of change that they're asking for, right? A sprint usually isn't trying to build your entire application. It's trying to develop a certain portion of your application to the point where it's demonstratable, right? So if the major change that's being requested is outside of the scope of the sprint, then just leave it until you're dealing with that portion of the application, whether you're reworking something or building something new, right? If it's not relevant to the portion that you're building right now, then there's no point in interrupting that flow and focus, right? If it is something where it's relevant to what's going on right now, well, then maybe it does make sense to say, okay, you know what, we need to step back. We need to, I would say, stop the sprint, decide what needs to change, and then restart the sprint, right? Or at least the portion of the sprint which those individuals are affected, right? That makes sense?
That makes perfect sense. And so last question here, we are a little bit over the time, but so last question, can we say Agile is a more expensive approach to project management compared to a traditional waterfall approach, given the uncertain nature of the methodology?
So I guess the question is, if you start down a waterfall approach and you end up with something that doesn't work, did you save money? So, this is the challenge, right? When you don't know what it is you're trying to create, you have a notion, but the reality is that you don't have something you can just go buy off the shelf, right? You're going to go build something that either has never been built or never been adapted in your organization before, right? The reality is that as you go along, you're going to learn things and realize that, oh, you know what, maybe that needs to be a little bit different than the way I originally envisioned it, right? So waterfall, and I use waterfall in lots of different applications, but waterfall is not great for dealing with change, whereas agile is really good at dealing with change. So it depends on the application, right? Getting to the end of a waterfall, which, and I've had projects where we got to the end and we said, da-da, and the client said, that doesn't work for us at all. Giant lawsuit occurs and, all these things, right? But they were involved all the way along and they check the boxes all the way along and they get to the end and, yeah, but that doesn't work, right? Well, is that the right answer? Would have we gotten a different result in that particular application had we used waterfall or agile, right? Where, we didn't end up in situations where client representatives were saying, oh, you know what, I guess it looks okay, right? And unfortunately, there are projects that fail, right? And our goal is to reduce them and minimize them, and wherever we can, salvage those relationships and move on, right? And again, this is why I say it isn't necessary that agile takes longer or is more expensive, but you are likely to end up with something at the end of agile that actually meets some needs and does some value, right? Whereas waterfall, that's not necessarily the case, right? Because it is a little more structured. And this is why I say waterfall is really well suited when you know where you're going and you've been there before, and the likelihood of pivots along the way are small.
Thank you. Wow, this was such an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. Those are all the questions for now. So again, I'm gonna repost the link here to the Kumo space. That is the space where you can go ahead and network with Brent and have a conversation and talk more about Agile or anything else that comes up along the way. So thank you so much, Brent, once again. Really appreciate your time and the knowledge and such a rich content. And we will see you again, I hope. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Santa. I very much appreciate it. Have a great day. We'll see you in the networking session. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.